Quarantine facilities are nothing new for Australia. This is the former North Head Quarantine Station in Sydney. It opened back in 1828 and ran all the way through until 1984. Even by today's standards, the layout is relatively sophisticated. The intention was to protect initially the colony from contagious disease arriving by ship. It grew and evolved over time, but remained largely effective. So why is it that almost 200 years later, Australia is locked in a political fight about how to handle quarantine?
Well, it's pretty clear under the Constitution and history of government in Australia that the federal government has responsibility for quarantine.
The National Cabinet took a decision early on in the crisis that it would be a shared responsibility, and that was a sensible decision which recognised that only state governments employ the public sector workforces that could ever man a national quarantine system on any scale.
They have, throughout this whole pandemic, played games, played politics, undermined us. This has all been about trying to deflect blame onto the states.
Kirsty Alfredson is an Australian citizen and a school teacher in Kent, where she's raising her family.
My dad's 83. He's got bone cancer and blood cancer and was having chemo. I feel like I need to help my parents. That's my main motivation for getting back, is that I just want to see my family. I want to see my father, want to see how he's faring.
Kirsty, a former journalist, has been planning her trip back to Brisbane since early this year. While she's been waiting to hear if she can travel tomorrow, Australia has decided to radically reduce the number of overseas arrivals it will accept each week.
I'm an Australian citizen, I've got an Australian passport, I'm fully vaccinated, I've got a letter from the doctor saying that my father has bone cancer and could I please have special consideration. So if I can't get into Australia, I'm not sure who can.
As the Delta variant popped up in multiple locations across Australia over the last few weeks, it's brought to a head months of simmering tensions between the states and the Commonwealth over who is responsible for quarantine arrangements and protecting Australians from the virus.
Imagine if a year ago, at least, the Commonwealth started looking at how we could have either greater capacity for hotel quarantine in more purpose-built facilities, and it just never happened because they took the view that it was the states managing this.
States do need to take responsibility for their areas of responsibility.
To understand how we got here, it's worth going back to the start of the pandemic. With community transmission running away from authorities, National Cabinet agreed that international arrivals would be required to spend 2 weeks in hotel quarantine.
These arrangements will be in place and they are mandatory.
The states implemented hotel quarantine and issues were apparent from the start.
A worker at a Melbourne quarantine hotel is among 8 people who've tested positive since yesterday.
2 separate breaches in Victoria at the Ridges and Stamford quarantine hotels triggered a deadly second wave of infections across the state. In August, it was Sydney's turn, with breaches at the Marriott Hotel. In October, former Health Department head Jane Holton delivered a review recommending alternate quarantine facilities be considered. While the federal government has since expanded numbers at its Howard Springs facility from 850 to 2,000, it didn't follow the Holton recommendations to use defence bases or immigration detention centres.
Many of the recommendations made by the Holton Review unfortunately couldn't be implemented. Our immigration detention facilities are at capacity at the moment because we're not in normal times. We can't deport someone whose visa has expired.
Up to the start of June this year, there were some 352,000 people through Australia's hotel quarantine system. And of almost 4,000 positive cases detected in quarantine during that time, there were 21 breaches, sparking multiple lockdowns. Labor's Katie Gallagher chairs the Senate COVID Committee, set up to provide oversight of the government's handling of the pandemic.
No one's actually done sort of comprehensive analysis about what would make a good a good alternative to hotel quarantine in terms of purpose-built facilities and where they are located. It was just this response from the Commonwealth was, hotel quarantine's there, that's what we're using. It's not perfect, but it's the best we can do, and the states are managing it, so we don't have to do anything up until it becomes a political problem for the Prime Minister.
And it is now a political problem. Breaches in Queensland, Western Australia, Victoria and New South Wales in the early stages of this year amplified calls for purpose-built alternatives.
They were never built to be quarantine facilities, but we've repurposed them and we're using them that way because we have to.
If we had an alternative to hotel for this particular variant of concern, we would not be here today.
Victoria proposed a regional quarantine facility and Queensland put forward a plan to build one in Toowoomba. Victoria has been approved, but the federal government rejected the Toowoomba proposal.
Well, I don't know the reasons for that, Hamish. I am pleased that we've got an actual agreement to build this centre in Victoria, and there, of course, is an offer to build centres in other states and territories on Commonwealth land, providing it meets the criteria that have been outlined, close to transport, particularly airports, obviously, but also close to acute healthcare facilities.
2 weeks ago, the federal government proposed a site at Pinkenba on Commonwealth land near the Brisbane airport.
Now, this one in Pinkenba is not going to be up and running for early next year, DP? Early next year. And the proposal in Toowoomba could be up and running in 2 months.
Queensland's Deputy Premier says it's a case of politics winning out over policy in the case of proposals like Toowoomba.
The only explanation I can see is that it's an LNP-held seat and that they didn't want to build it in an LNP-held seat. But the fact is Labor doesn't hold many seats in Queensland. There's not many places you could build it in a Labor-held seat.
That's classic Stephen Miles. He looks for a fight every day he goes out there in the media. He throws punches on behalf of the Palaszczuk government, looks to bicker, looks to distract from their own failures.
And it's that political brinkmanship where no new facilities have yet been built, some states have their own ideas, and the hotel quarantine system is straining under the pressure of the Delta variant that's led us here, to a national cabinet decision to slash the numbers of overseas arrivals. As of July 14, the number of weekly arrivals will halve from 6,070 to 3,035.
I'm actually quite worried about the notion of completely reducing the number of people coming in, given the tens of thousands still of vulnerable Australians who are waiting to come home.
I was a bit disappointed to see the premiers, particularly Premier Andrews and Premier Palaszczuk, campaigning for a 75 to 80% reduction in the number of Australians who can return to Australia each week. I don't think the state premiers really appreciate, because they're not at the coalface of making those decisions of who can come and who can leave, what the profound impact that has on those people.
The reduction in numbers leaves people like Murray Bourne in Singapore anxious. He's a fully vaccinated Australian with a flight booked to return home with his wife.
Unfortunately, with numbers cut by half, we don't know what is going to happen. We don't know when we're going to be told, and do we go ahead and pack up? Do we go ahead and start shipping our materials back to Australia, or do we just give up?
He believes it makes sense for fully vaccinated returnees from a low-risk country to be given the opportunity to quarantine at home on arrival.
There was a lot of talk about arm wristlet bands and making sure people actually stay where they are. It doesn't worry us to wear those at all. If you want me to stay home, I'll stay home. I just don't want to be locked up in a room next to somebody who's coughing and spluttering and sending all of his virus through the hotel. Because that's the most dangerous part.
State and federal politicians have told 7:30 for this story that quarantine facilities will still be needed at least to the end of this year and into next. But as vaccination rates increase, Australia will need to use home quarantine.
The truth of the matter is, if you're fully vaccinated, if the community is broadly protected, I think we'll get to a position where we actually don't need those people to be quarantined. We may want them to be tested to make sure that they haven't brought something into the country, but I do think we're looking at a very different world.
For Kirsty Alfredson, the signs are good that she will travel tomorrow and see her 83-year-old father in Australia. It's a trip that's been a long time coming.
I haven't seen him for 2 years. I'd be really devastated if I couldn't see him.
Hi, I'm Lee Sales. Thanks for watching this story. If you'd like to watch more of 7:30's stories, they are on the left of your screen. And tap on the button below to subscribe and get the latest from ABC News.